Shabbat Shalom. Without question, one of the most gracious and memorable invitations ever extended to me was when Rabbi Dr. Eugene Borowitz of blessed memory invited me to teach a class of his at Hebrew Union College. Dr. Borowitz, who died just about 2 weeks ago at the age of 91, was one of, if not the most influential American Jewish theologian of the last few decades, the chief ideologue of the Reform movement, the author of over 20 books, hundreds of articles and essays. Dr. Borowitz has shaped the thinking of generations of rabbis and their students within the Reform movement and well beyond. A few years ago, with the encouragement of the Synagogue, I put together a book entitled Jewish Theology in Our Time. It was a thrill like no other to discover that the volume had become assigned reading in Dr. Borowitz's theology seminar for rabbinical students. You can only imagine the honor that I felt when Dr. Borowitz reached out to me to co-teach the sessions covering the subject matter of my book and offer my own assessments on the current state of Jewish theological thought. While I cannot claim we were ever close or having been formally his student, since his passing I've looked back on my exchanges with him with great fondness, well aware of the rare privilege it was those few afternoons to rub shoulders with one of the theological giants of our time. Given the magnitude of his prolific career, it would be foolhardy and not a little bit disrespectful to try to distill the breadth and depth of Borowitz's writing into a single sermon. Rather, I want to focus on one small volume of his, for which he won the National Book Award, that I think provides an entryway into his assessment of American Jewry, his theology, and in my estimation, the tools by which we understand the challenges and opportunities of being an American Jew today. The book, published in 1973, is called The Mask Jews Wear: The Self-Deceptions of American Jewry, the title of the book being its central thesis. There was a time in Jewish history, Borowitz explains, during 14th and 15th century Spain, when Jews had to convert to Catholicism in order to survive. These Jews were called Marranos, and they took on a Catholic exterior, but on the inside remained steadfastly, albeit somewhat idiosyncratically, Jewish. Contemporary Jewry, however, as products of the Emancipation and Enlightenment, face a very different set of opportunities and challenges. No longer living in the shtetls or the ghettos of Eastern Europe, we've emigrated geographically, economically, and most important, sociologically, into the freedoms and allures of cosmopolitan society that embraces Jews as Jews. This warm acceptance has resulted in the rise of a new species of Jew, what Borowitz calls a reverse Marrano, an American Jew who is openly and proudly Jewish on the outside, but on the inside is estranged from his or her Judaism. It is, in Borowitz's estimation, the tremendous and unprecedented blessings as experienced by American Jews that have ironically led to a Jewry detached from Jewish life and learning, alienated from the very religious heritage that prior generations had fought so valiantly to preserve and defend. All of this, however, is really only the beginning, because Borowitz's contention is that it is because our very freedoms have cast American Jewry into a form of spiritual exile that we've constructed a series of masks, or as my teacher, Dr. Byron Sherwin calls them, substitute faiths, compensatory gestures that masquerade the self-knowledge that we are not who we really say we are. On the most basic level, American Jews practice a sort of chopped liver or lox and bagels Judaism, whereby we think that the thinnest manifestation of Jewish identity somehow serves as a substitute for a rich engagement with the riches of our faith and tradition. We are reverse Marranos, We're proud of our Jewishness, pointing to Jerry Seinfeld and Mark Zuckerberg and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, counting off Jewish Nobel laureates, an Adam Sandlerification of Judaism that hardly serves to fortify the depth of our faith and is an altogether unreliable means to transmit it to the next generation. Alternatively, American Jews will engage in what philosophers call the reductionist fallacy, mistakenly identifying or reducing the whole of Judaism into one of its parts. To take an easy example, we frame the argument for Jewish identity not on its merits, but in the language of Holocaust remembrance, the obligation to be Jewish lest we hand Hitler a posthumous victory. Or we throw our energies into identifying and fighting anti-Semitism, to be sure an altogether worthy cause, but a far cry from an argument for positive Jewish identity. I imagine if you were asked many American Jews what defines their Judaism, they would cite ethics or tikkun olam, the obligation to mend the world, forgetting that one can, and many actually do, lead a moral life, feed the sick, and clothe the poor without being Jewish. Finally, if you were here last week, then you will recall our speaker, Jeffrey Goldberg, pressing the point that in many quarters of the Jewish world, its advocacy on behalf of Israel, important as it is, that has become a vicarious expression of Jewish life, the largest kosher chicken dinner of American Jewry being the AIPAC convention in D.C. Neither support for Israel, nor for that matter Zionism, is a substitute for Judaism. The list goes on, and don't misunderstand me. Each expression is important. I personally sit on the boards of UJA, of JDC, of ADL. I will be eating that chicken dinner, and so should you at the AIPAC convention. But Borowitz's point, nevertheless, is that these civic or secular or institutional behaviors or associations in and unto themselves are not Judaism. They are substitutes, masks, by which an alienated American Jewry compensates for want of a living, vibrant, engaged expression of Jewish faith. Fair or unfair, agree or disagree, as a conservative rabbi, the most interesting thing about Borowitz's diagnosis is that it comes from the pen of the chief ideologue of the Reform movement. The shibboleth of the Reform movement is personal autonomy, often understood as a cafeteria-style form of Jewish living, whereby one can pick and choose, mix and match Jewish practice and ritual, or even choose not to practice at all. How do we square Borowitz's sober assessment of American Jewry with Reform Judaism's affirmation of every Jew's right to make decisions as to how to express their Judaism? Which is why, when speaking of Borowitz's theological legacy, we do him a great disservice if we limit ourselves to his critique of American Judaism. From a brief article he wrote in 1961 and into the decades to come, Borowitz sought to inspire American Jewry to adopt what he called covenantal theology, a theology that, quote, rests upon a reaffirmation in contemporary terms of the covenant of Sinai. Just as a covenant between two people demands a give and take, a willingness for ongoing dialogue and dialectic, and a certain elasticity to allow for the possibility that tomorrow we may be different than we are today, all the more so between a Jew and his or her God. In Borowitz's own words, such a theology is, quote, a way of living one's life based on a relationship with God, a relationship in which the whole self is involved. As with any relationship worth having, the bond cannot be distilled or reduced into a single aspect. A covenantal relationship with God, akin to the compendium of laws we read in our Torah reading this morning, runs the gamut, including ethics, the holiday cycle, faith, ritual observance, the promise of the land, and beyond. Each of these building blocks, constitutive blocks of Jewish life. And like any I-thou or intimate relationship, Borowitz was influenced by Martin Buber. The impetus for why we do what we do as Jews cannot come by way of a top-down command, but rather by us seeing these choices we make as opportunities to give full expression to the covenantal relationship we have with God. As a Reformed theologian, Borowitz is faithful to the notions of personal autonomy. He knows that American Jews will forever seek to negotiate our American selves with our Jewish selves, but it is by way of our personal conscience that we can hear God's command, that we can give that relationship expression, and that we can continue to grow in relation to God. Finally, Borowitz's covenant theology makes clear that God's covenant is not one with an individual Jew, but with the Jewish people as a whole. As such, while being a Jew may begin with the individual, Jewish existence is not merely personal, but communal and even public. To be a Jew means you believe one's personal destiny is tied into a narrative longer and larger than any one individual's well-being. It's not either or. A fulfilling Jewish life exists within a concentric set of circles, ever tethered to the Jewish community, always anchored with empathy for our common humanity. In rereading Borowitz these last few weeks since his passing, I've been struck by a feeling akin to whiplash. On the one hand, I hear the voice of a post-Holocaust theologian, a man whose major writings reflect a time and place far removed from the present. On the other hand, the prophetic element of his insights is altogether jarring, in that both his descriptive assessments and his prescriptive recommendations strike me as eerily oracular in nature. Are we not, I wonder, in desperate need of the faith that Borowitz describes? An American Jewry in intimate relation with God, an American Jewry who can pray and study Torah with the same facility and passion that they debate the policies of the Israeli government, an American Jewry who understands that a forced choice between particularism and universalism is a false choice, an American Jewry who sees a Jewish life of observance not as a list of do's and don'ts, but as opportunities to enhance, to elevate, and engage in one's covenantal relationship with God. And yes, an American Jewry who knows deep down in his or her kishkas that each and every one of us are existentially connected one to the other. Reform, conservative, orthodox, or none of the above, Borowitz's theology should be required reading for anyone interested in building up the future of our people. This morning, we read of the children of Israel standing at the base of Mount Sinai, the record of the covenant spoken aloud in the presence of all. Famously, Israel responds with just two words, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will listen. The ordering of the words, the sages have long noted, are not what one would expect. Far more sensible would have been the Israelites to first hear, nishma, the contents of God's law, and then and only then agree to observe. And yet their faith was of such a quality, so earnest, so eager to fulfill God's law, that they entered into that covenant on their own free will and volition. Every command an opportunity to be drawn closer to the divine will. Our task, our opportunity, is no different today than it was for the Israelites of old. May our generation and the generations to come renew our covenant with God. May we gain sufficient confidence in our faith so as to dispense with the masks that we wear. And may the legacy of Morenu Harav Yechiel Baruch ben Binyamin Malka, Rabbi Dr. Eugene Borowitz, continue to inspire us for generations to come. Shabbat Shalom.